Welcome back. We're here to talk about the last two sections of this lecture. We're going to talk about the dermis and the subcutaneous layer. At first, I thought that we would just put the dermis separate from the subcutaneous layer, but I think that we're going to be able to do both in one recording. So take a look at our flow chart here. The dermis is made of dense, irregular connective tissue, and there are two different regions that we're going to talk about, the papillary region and the deeper reticular region. So as you look at this drawing, let me move myself over here. As you look at this drawing, what strikes you as being different between the dermis and the epidermis? Well, at first glance, hopefully you've maybe noticed something about the different layers. There are very clear layers in the epidermis, starting with the stratum basale and then moving all the way up to the stratum corneum. Whereas in the dermis, you don't really have those very distinct layers of cells. Rather, it looks kind of uniform all the way through. Let me move myself over here. Okay, so our dermis is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, which means that it has a lot of collagen and a lot of elastic fibers. And recall that collagen and elastic fibers are simply proteins. But this is dense, irregular connective tissue, which means that these protein fibers are not arranged in a uniform fashion, like they're not all facing one direction. Instead, they are arranged kind of in a random order where they're all kind of crossing each other, forming a net-like structure. And this is going to help to give the skin its strength so that it can stretch and withstand stress in a number of different directions. If all of these fibers were situated all in the same order, it would only be able to resist stretching in two directions. But since it's all in different directions, it's going to lend strength to the structure of the skin. So these fibers are suspended within a gelatinous matrix. And within that matrix, we have different kinds of cells like fibroblasts, which are going to form the collagen fibers, and some adipose cells or fat cells, and then also macrophages, which will play a role again in protecting the body against microbial invasion. The dermis is also going to contain blood vessels, nerves, glands, and hair follicles. Now, we're going to talk more about the nerves, glands, and hair follicles later, but for now, I just want you to see where these different blood vessels are located. Notice that they kind of follow these ridges that are formed by the dermis and the stratum basale, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But the thing I want you to see right now is how close these blood vessels are to that division between the dermis and the epidermis. So the more superficial region of the dermis is called the papillary region. And the papillary region is the part of the dermis that actually makes contact with the stratum basale. The papillary region contains some thin collagen and elastic fibers. And if you notice, the papillary region is making these bumps that extend up into the epidermis itself. These finger-like or peg-like projections are called the dermal papillae. So the dermal papillae are important because, as I mentioned before, hold on, I gotta move myself again. As I mentioned before, they're going to contain these blood vessels or capillary loops. And it's here in these capillary loops that oxygen and nutrients are going to diffuse from and then enter into the stratum basale. So that's how these mitotic cells inside of the stratum basale get the nutrients and the oxygen that they need in order to perform their functions. It's also the way that they're able to get rid of waste products and carbon dioxide, which are products of their cellular processes. Now, there are a couple of other things that are contained within the dermal papillae, and these include corpuscles. of touch and also free nerve endings. So these receptors are going to sense light pressure and then also pain. That's what the free nerve endings do. Now, the portion of the epidermis that extends down, if you can see my red pen, it extends down into the dermis itself. These are called the epidermal ridges. So you can see that the dermal papillae are going to extend upward while the epidermal ridges extend down. And what happens is that they lock together so that our two layers of skin can't slide and separate from each other. So because we have these ridges, we have increased surface area. We've increased the contact between the epidermis and the dermis itself. The reticular region is the deeper layer of the dermis, and here you're going to find thicker collagen fibers and thicker elastic fibers. And as I said before, this is where you're going to see more of a net-like arrangement, and this is going to allow for the strength of the skin itself. Now, maybe some of you have had older brothers and sisters or cousins or something, and maybe you've experienced a twist burn, like where they take your forearm and they kind of twist the skin in different directions. If you've ever experienced that and you look at your arm now, you'll probably see that there's no evidence of that ever happening to you. And that's because of the arrangements of these fibers. If the fibers had been arranged in all of the same direction, well, then there could be tearing and you would have stretch mark like marks on your skin, which would be evidence of a tearing or a ripping of the dermis itself. As I mentioned before, we have a number of different cells that are found inside of the dermis. And there are accessory structures, like if we look at our picture here, like hair follicles, we have muscles, we have sweat glands, and we have sebaceous glands that are all a part of the dermis. They all reside in the dermis, and we're going to talk about those accessory structures later. All right, next we move on to our subcutaneous layer, which is connected to the skin, but it's not actually a part of the skin, and it is consisting of areolar tissue and adipose tissue. So the hypodermis, if we take a look at this word and we take it apart, hypo means below, and then dermis means skin. So this is the section that is found, that is found below the skin. And our hypodermis consists of areolar tissue and adipose tissue. So areolar tissue, it's similar to dense irregular tissue. It's just that there are more spaces, like there's more matrix in areolar tissue than there are in the dense irregular tissue. So there's not going to be as many protein fibers in areolar tissue as there are in the dense irregular tissue. And the adipose tissue is simply fat cells. And so recall that fat cells really have just a droplet that contains lipids in it, and it's a place for lipid storage. So the dermis is going to anchor itself to the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer, because remember that the epidermis and the dermis together make up the cutaneous membrane. And then the hypodermis itself is attached to more connective tissue called fascia. And then that connects to the muscle tissue that is located below. So the hypodermis is going to offer us some fat storage because it contains adipose cells. There's also going to be blood vessels that are found there. And because there are these spaces that are found inside of our areolar tissue, nutrients and oxygen from the blood vessels are going to diffuse away from these blood vessels and enter into the dermis in order to serve the various cells that are there, while the waste products from these places are going to diffuse back into those venous venules and enter into the bloodstream and be carried away from the tissue. We also have something called lamellated corpuscles, which are found within or near the hypodermis. And these are receptors, and here's one right over here in our picture, that are going to sense deep pressure. So if you're about to step off of a curb into traffic, for instance, and your friend grabs your arm and yanks you back, and you're like, ow, that hurt my arm. You know, the reason why you're feeling that is because the pressure of your friend's grip activated these lamellated corpuscles. All right, and finally, I just wanted to make mention of skin color, and I'm talking about this now because our melanocytes are largely found in the stratum basale, and again, they are going to get their nutrients and their oxygen from the blood vessels that are found in the capillary loops inside of the papillary layer of the dermis. Remember that I mentioned that the amount of pigment that your skin contains has to do with the accumulation of melanin, which is found inside of the melanocytes. So our freckles or moles or age spots, as one gets older, uh, ultraviolet exposure to just daily sunlight increases its production. There are some other things that are going to affect the color of one's skin, such as hemoglobin. The amount of hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen will help to give tone to the skin. So, oxyhemoglobin, which is bound to oxygen, will give it a reddish color. Whereas if someone is hypoxic or if they don't have enough oxygen in their blood, they may appear ashen or a little bit blue in color. Another molecule called keratin in large amounts in the blood can give somebody an orangey kind of tint. And if you're thinking keratin, I've heard that before. Yeah, that is found in carrots and in sweet potatoes and in any other orange kind of vegetable or all right. The next time that we meet, we will talk about the accessory structures of the skin. Here is a little preview of that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.